gaming genres, roguelikes and roguelites have perhaps the most abusive relationships towards players with an added touch of Stockholm Syndrome to sate everyone's inner masochist. Sometimes you can hardly tell what the entertainment is from what is meant to be punishment, but the ever-increasing likelihood of success after countless failures is what makes these genres so tantalizing. The real challenge for a review of a rogue-style game is to explain why one form of flagellation is more favorable to the countless other experiences that cannot maintain this balance of fun and hardship. Every once in a while, however, you do manage to find one means of torture that scratches a particular niche, and suddenly everything you once couldn't articulate is now made clear. Like painful memories from my subconscious worming its way into my thoughts, Sword of the Stars The Pit is the self-inflicting abuse for me. Before we continue on with the reviews, note the plural form of the word, there are a few pieces of information to preface. First, if the title screen or the name of the video wasn't your first clue, this video will discuss the Osmium edition from the original Pit, which is a complete game, as well as the early access state of Pit Infinity, or if you want to go by its original name, the Pit of Doom. From here onwards, and for the sake of simplicity, these games will be referred to as the Pit and the Pit of Doom. Second, and you probably have noticed the sudden increase in quality of the Pit of Doom footage taken from Kerberos Productions, the footage I am using does not represent the actual visual or technical quality of the game. This aspect is something that I will delve into more detail with the second review, and I was able to squeeze out a more stable frame rate for recording with Unreal Engine 4 tweaks, but I state this information up front if you were concerned that the game was poorly optimized. In reality, the game runs incredibly well on my low-end hardware without a significant impact on performance, with the proper tweaks. I had to further degrade the game so that it would run better for recording. Finally, there is footage of the vanilla version of the Pit as well as with the Quality of Life mod, which adds only UI and other technical polishes to the vanilla game. With those disclaimers out of the way, pack your sandwiches, an extra Hyver multi-tool, and a whole lot of duct tape for your organs as we delve straight into 95.9 almost certain death in The Pit. Given the prevalence of roguelite titles with numerous deviations, it's hard to recall what it means to experience a proper roguelite such as The Pit. Now, I won't belabor this subject in any great detail as I had already brought up the topic in my last review of Bad North. What I do want to illustrate is that what is often acceptable in roguelites does not mean it's also applicable to roguelikes. And this fundamental dissociation is what will make or will break this game for many people who go into the Pit with the faulty logic that these genres are the same. Whenever you hear the topic brought up about the problems of roguelites, people are often concerned with the reliance on luck-based mechanics that can take away from rewarding raw skill. However, if you really examine the heavyweights like The Binding of Isaac or Enter the Gungeon, I would argue that more people would say they prefer sessions when the game gives them items to lower the threshold for the hardest challenges. This is why so many players who enjoy these titles focus on optimizing their builds, finding an item to make them overpowered, or learning exploits to achieve a greater chance of success. It's only the players who rely on the RNG elements that are cheating themselves of getting better at the game. But this solution is also not at the cost of making the game easier for players who do get better at understanding the core mechanics. This balance is what most roguelites strive to accomplish when finding an equilibrium between luck and skill. As a result, the key to a great roguelite is the following. If you design a roguelite by first making the game built around its highest skill demands, such as the original Binding of Isaac that made all rooms the same size and all enemies, including bosses, have avoidable attacks, you can then design the rest of the game to lower that threshold with the randomized items and luck-based rewards. Roguelikes, on the other hand, besides sharing the premise of making a game built from the top down in terms of skill, go about this means of accessibility in a completely different manner. Or, to describe the situation with a cheeky phrase, roguelikes are all about being skillful of your odds. Now, roguelikes do employ similar metagaming strategies often found in roguelites, such as loot drops or optimizing builds, but what separates them is the core gameplay. There is no FPS bunny hopping mechanic to evade danger like in Immortal Redneck. There is no bullet hell screen nukes to avoid taking damage like in Enter the Gungeon, and there are no invincibility frames or platforms such as in Rogue Legacy. Instead of building the gameplay off of other genres, roguelikes have very little, if any, skill attributed to the actual mechanics, which are almost universally turn-based tactics, and you simply cannot win by mashing the attack button. What this changes for the rest of the game are the type of skills you foster to become better. Except now, all these skills are determined by luck, and your role is being the one who calls the shots when and where. However, it would be foolish to suggest there is no skill in playing the odds, as there is a world of a difference between someone who plays the lottery and a professional poker player. Coming back to the actual topic of the video, if you understand this fundamental distinction between roguelites and roguelikes, then you will be able to decide whether the pit is worth playing. The real skill that you have to master in order to overcome the pit is learning the game inside and out, which can be as difficult as surviving. This aspect is more than a metagame quality of getting better, as the Sotspedia, the in-game encyclopedia, is constantly being updated with new information about new enemies, new items, and new recipes you can either discover from trial and error and risk losing your ingredients, or you can decipher from the terminals. In addition, there are 13, 16 if you include the fan mod, classes to master across 5 difficulty modes that will keep you constantly relearning the game just when you thought you knew it all. Even if you perish, and you will if the Solka are living up to their reputation, your deaths are a means to learn from your many, many mistakes that you will make as you play. Eventually, you'll be able to use your own deaths to make your later runs more profitable. All of these, and many more strategies, will come with time if you choose to invest the patience and the curiosity to keep trying against the odds. Unlike real life, however, there are various ways to streamline the learning process, such as the improvements added to the fan mod, as well as with the quality of life mod, that will let you unlock all recipes, all items, or both. Personally, given how much these options impact the reward system of dying, and how much information there is to take in from the start, I would not recommend unlocking these options unless you don't care about having everything available to you. Even if you don't wish to use these features, I would recommend installing the quality of life mod before you begin, because if you install it later, it will wipe all your save progress, so you'll have to start over again, or, more likely, you will choose to unlock everything. In addition to the suggestion, this next section will go over what I would suggest for newcomers to get the best experience, as well as to inform you how some of the underlying mechanics work. This information will hopefully help you from scratching your head on numbers that are within your control, from wasting your time on the simplest of mistakes, and from suffering the journey that comes by experience. Since audiences to roguelikes and roguelites are more sensitive to spoilers, especially gameplay related ones, I would ask that you listen until the blue rooms are discussed. At that point, you can skip to the timestamp on the screen so you can learn the game on your own. These other pieces of information are more so general knowledge about the game, such as the various modes you can choose, as well as the game's structure. With that warning out of the way, let's begin where all misfortunes in life start, the beginning. As the introduction cinematic illustrates, you are one of innumerable adventurers sent into an ancient Solka facility known as the Pit in search of a cure for a deadly virus. Although the story is framed as being a concern for mankind, there is little explanation as to why other alien races are seeking the Pit. The most likely explanation is that this discrepancy was a development oversight since the game originally only had 3 classes of humans. Furthermore, there's not much storytelling about the Pit itself. Outside of lore entries that add some colorful humor from the Sword of the Stars universe, the story never expands on the setup other than providing you a simple goal: survive. Now, the original release tasked you to survive 30 floors that progressively became bigger the farther down you went. After the Mind Games expansion, all future versions pushed the final floor to floor 40, as well as added new mechanics like the psionic system, 10 additional characters, and tons upon tons of new items into the Pit's arsenal. However, in terms of how this change affected the game's progression, these 10 additional floors smoothed out the difficulty curve since the game could be balanced around a longer session. What was once a 5 to 10 hour journey could now take up to 15 hours if you took your time, which was most likely due to the player shuffling around his or her inventory. Consequently, this added length also created new starting locations to unlock, new modes to play, as well as a way for the player to game the system. Now, the original release did have starting floors where the trade-off was that you could start on lower floors without having to progress through the entire game. These checkpoints were located every 5 floors until you reach level 15, but with the Gold Edition, those checkpoints now start at floor 10 and stop at floor 20. This method would effectively let you start halfway through the game with all your starting gear perfectly intact, and the downside would be that your character would always start at level 1. This trade-off wouldn't be worth it if it wasn't for the implementation of the blue safe rooms, but we're not quite going to talk about those mechanics yet. The other major change from the Gold Edition was the addition of game speed modes, which are time-saving ways to play the game more quickly than normal. These two modes, fast and quick, offer a distinct way of playing that can cut off a lot of the fat by giving you XP boosts in return, as well as address some of the game's shortcomings. For a side-by-side comparison, if I were to beeline a Tarka warrior from the entrance to floor 10, it would generally take me a little over an hour on normal, 40 to 45 minutes on fast, and quick would take me around 30 to 40 minutes at most. Quick mode has the shortest time due to the fact that you are skipping even number floors if you start from the entrance, and odd number floors if you start on floor 10 or 20. These advantages, while it may sound simple, can be used in various complex ways to make the game more streamlined, and the quick mode makes the game more like the original release since you only have to complete 20 levels. It's not until you combine these game modes with the blue rooms where you can see their full potential. Now, the blue rooms themselves are fairly straightforward. You can store items and XP that you have not spent on floors 10, 15, and 20 for future playthroughs. The real catch is how you can use them to your advantage, although they also come with some limitations to keep the game balanced. At first, you will likely ignore these rooms because you don't want to give up anything you might need to complete your run, but you may store any weapons or armor your characters cannot use because of their race. If you decide to cache any XP, you'll realize that you'll receive 5 XP points for every 1 point you invest, meaning you get 5 times of an investment whatever you deposit. And you'll soon learn every character needs the same amount of XP to level up, but each character earns them at different rates. The catch with these cached items and the XP storage is that you can only withdraw from these containers once when you start a new game on the same floor, and each cache on floors 10, 15, and 20 are independent from one another as well as by difficulty. If you play the game the way it is intended, by depositing these rewards every now and then, you could easily accumulate more than enough resources either because you cannot use them, you don't know how to use them, or you're going to lose. Conversely, you can make corpse runs for XP, ammo, or other useful items for a weak character, or for your current character to be more prepared for the rest of the game. However, if you think you can simply win the game by dumping all your stats and gear on floor 20 to make a level 50 character, then you're not seeing what you're trading off in return. You could probably get by with this method on easy and normal difficulties, but then you would be ignoring how exactly the skill and the stat system works. If you have ever felt the cravings of progress when leveling up during tabletop games or CRPGs, the Pit's leveling up system is a distilled, tactful concoction of tried and true RPG mechanics. Surprisingly, the skill system shares a lot in common with Oblivion, but without all the negative aspects. Every skill has an associated stat, might, finesse, brains, or power, and you can progress every skill naturally through continued usage up to level 45. For psionic abilities, you can naturally level them up to 100. Even if your current skill is above 45, if the gray stat is less than 45, it can still naturally level up, and every 5 stat points invested also improves related skills. Now, when you level up, and what separates this system from Oblivion, is that the amount of skill points and stat points are always the same per class, but the cost to improve a skill depends on if you have used them. What this system boils down to is that when you use a skill, you can naturally improve it, or you can improve it as you level up for a lower cost, and a higher reward. As a result, if you want to use the blue rooms, you want to withdraw just enough XP to match the floor level plus 1. So 11 for floor 10, level 16 for floor 15, and level 21 for floor 20, so that you can still allocate all your points as well as benefit from the natural level ups. Now if you're still following along, you're probably thinking this all sounds like a grind, and you are half right, but it's how you go about a grind, which is purely optional, and what you set as your goals that could separate learning how to become better at the game rather than making it easier. Here then is what I would argue is the best way to enjoy the pit. First, play your preferred character on easy or normal, and try to unlock either the 10th or the 15th floor as starting points. You might want to start out on easy, but don't get too comfortable because all skills start out with an extra 15 points, and you won't be able to unlock all the recipes unless you are on normal. Afterwards, try out the other classes and attempt to make it to floor 10 without leveling up so you can get an idea of each character's strengths and weaknesses. By this point, all of your stockpiled XP and gear will be more than enough for you to decide if you want to start your favorite character on floor 10 or continue foraging certain items like armor to tackle the next 30 floors. Additionally, you could also try the quick mode from the blue rooms if you want to speed the game up further, or you can play the mode from the entrance to experience the game legitimately. Whatever method you wish to experience the pit, legitimately or otherwise, if you are willing to accept your losses when you make a mistake, you will likely not make that same mistake again. Or if you do, you'll be better prepared to handle the situation. With the addition of the quick mode that cuts the game in half, or even more if you start on floor 20, I don't find this game inherently flawed as it could be given how long these sessions can last. If you can enjoy this game whether you are winning or losing, then you truly have overcome the mental gauntlet that is the pit. Still probably means you're going to die, except this time you'll face death with a smile. As you might expect, I have yet to finish the game as the closest I have ever reached was floor 37 on easy. The fact that I have not won, but I desire to go once more into the fray, even with 50 hours across 7 years of playtime, has to be an indicator either of my declining mental health or the game's extraordinary quality. Even in cases where I had made the same mistake, such as not treating poison or disease seriously after my last demise, these moments are something that was my error rather than from bad fortune. Once you have enough recipes or stockpiles to counter these types of problems, or you don't forget that you have plenty to use, the game's cheapest deaths can be circumvented. In reality, unless you are making a floor 1 to 10 run, it can often be harder to die than it is to actually keep pressing onwards with little to no hope for success. Now, do all these explanations and defenses of the game mean that it is perfect? Absolutely not. If I could count the number of times I stepped on a wormhole that sent me 2 floors ahead, then I would have more of these blunders than copies of myself in the multiverse. Durability, while not as much of a problem if you plan ahead with backup guns or armor, or if you play on quick mode, can have too much of an effect on the early game where it encourages you to remove your armor and to punch enemies so you don't degrade your gear too early. AI basically boils down to melee and projectile threats with different stats and status effects. Inventory management, which is made somewhat more bearable with the quality of life mod, creates too much micromanagement when the game could automatically rearrange items for you. Food cannot be used to their fullest without having the full recipe list, which is a problem when food becomes incredibly scarce past floor 30. Finally, while there are boss-like threats, the last floor is a fixed gauntlet of enemies as you make your way towards the center, and the payoff is anticlimactic with no real final antagonist. You might look at some of these problems more strongly than I do for others. Despite these numerous grievances, none tarnish what is ultimately one of the best roguelite experiences out there besides Tales of Magiel, and you will find far fewer sci-fi roguelites as polished as the Pit. Sometimes, as Jack London once said, when life deals you a bad hand, it's knowing how and when to play that is the key to success rather than lamenting when you don't have the best cards. Compared to the original, Pit Infinity, or the Pit of Doom if you want to use its original name, is an interesting case study of the problems associated with transitioning roguelike elements into a roguelite experience. If you recall the discussion from long ago about the importance of genre expectations, The Pit of Doom is why that tangent was necessary. Unless you are an avid fan of the Pit, or you want to try out what is the most roguelite first-person shooter out there with your friends, this game is a hard sell to newcomers. But it is an absolute steal if you get the bundle for both games. Ironically, it's the limitations of its roguelike foundation that hampers what could be a more satisfying first-person roguelite dungeon crawler, although the game is perhaps too simplistic when you compare it to its competition. You would be forgiven if you thought the Pit of Doom is a similar 2D to 3D transition like Risk of Rain 2, but the game is more like playing the Legend of Zelda VR mod, as the 3D transition masquerades its two-dimensional simplicity. This statement is not a criticism levied at the game, but more so the rationale as to why I thoroughly enjoyed this version as much as the original. You might even argue this immersive quality was the intended goal, because the game goes for a more atmospheric soundtrack, and there's a greater sense of scale provided by the 3D models. All smoke and mirrors aside, the Pit of Doom may not excel as a first-person roguelike, but it does just enough right to be an acceptable first-person roguelike, which shouldn't be too much of a surprise given that it's essentially a total conversion mod of the original release of the Pit. Now, we've already discussed how the Pit plays, so there's no sense of regurgitating the same information. It would be more useful to mention what is different and what are new problems for the Pit of Doom. Afterwards, we can break down the mechanics and how they function when put into the first-person perspective. Unfortunately, there is no active player base who is interested in queuing up with strangers, so if you want to play cooperatively, you'll have to bring friends with you. Anyway, the first thought that comes to mind is the question, how much did Kerberos recreate from the original? Similar to the original release of the Pit of Doom currently has the main three human classes, the Marine, the Scout, and the Engineer, who all have the same loadouts and builds. It's important to highlight this information because there are alien weapons, which means you'll suffer a racial debuff to your accuracy. This regression from the original's 13 classes is a necessary step in order to balance the game during its early access development, as well as share similar assets. But I do hope Kerberos adds all 5 races. Who doesn't want to play as a giant telekinetic space dolphin that can use its tentacles as whips? Or who doesn't want to team up with a quirky humanoid Ant-Man? Not that one. Wielding a flamethrower. Speaking of gameplay regressions, this version is before the Mind Games expansion, so the game ends on floor 30, if there was a final floor and not an infinite loop, and there are no psionics. The devs haven't denied the possibility that these features could return. They have stated the roadmap is to take bits and pieces of the Osmium edition, but if there isn't a human scion, then you can be certain that the other classes won't come back because they all have 1 or 2 psionic branches. Finally, there are no safe rooms, so you cannot exploit this game in your favor like before, although they may bring this feature back for single player mode only. While you would normally expect a total conversion mod to include everything from before, this game is still jam-packed full of content to avoid feeling like a downgrade. As far as FPS conversions of games often turn out, the gunplay and the underlining stats of the original Rogue-Lite works enough to get the job done. If you recall what I had said about the stats system, then you'll remember how it's comparable to Oblivion. The combat system of the Pit of Doom, funnily enough, best resembles Morrowind. At least that is what I can take away from the developer's response, so let me explain how and why. If you recall from the original Pit, stats affected skills, and skills could be affected by continued usage, successfully or not. This RPG system is analogous to every modern Elder Scrolls game. There are vital deviations, such as the fact that all normal skills can naturally level up to 45 in Grey Text, and leveling up only influences how much skill points you needed to invest to improve one skill based on what you had recently used. Damage calculation, however, was also tied to skills, but weapons had a minimum damage threshold and requirements to wield them. The Pit of Doom, however, combines this number crunching method with first-person combat and zero location-based hitboxes. Aiming is only one component for how much damage you can deal. Skills, aiming down sights versus hip firing, movement, crouching, and tables with normal, critical, and glancing damage values all play some small role when factored into the overall calculation. What this conclusion means is the Pit of Doom's gunplay is analogous to firing a bow or swinging a sword in Morrowind, where damage and accuracy are dice-based, which the only two things that determine if you hit the target is if you are aiming within the general vicinity as well as RNG. You can see this consequence more pronounced with melee weapons, as you often find yourself missing. If you pay attention to where your shots land, you'll also notice your critical shots strike the same area you last dealt a glancing weak shot. Given how difficult it can be to gauge the hitboxes of an enemy, such as the worms, this system does have its merits to prevent the gameplay from interfering with the zany enemy design. That summary is the simplest explanation of how the first-person mechanics work, and it's not a system that I find makes the gameplay worse. It does, however, make the gameplay come across even more streamlined than the turn-based tactics the series is built on. Not to open a crate full of Zool worms, and the topic is inevitably going to be brought up by someone else, but this regression makes me wonder what the Sword of the Stars fanbase thinks about a series once known for its 4X roots now being made into a first-person shooter, albeit one rooted in roguelike mechanics. Granted, there is the tabletop game to satiate the fanbase needs, and there is Stellaris, another controversial subject that I will save for another day, so I'm not bothered by what some may view as a gross simplification from a franchise that often seems to dream bigger than what it can achieve. Regardless, the Pit of Doom can be a great time, alone or with friends, if you have any willing to share your misery. And it should be obvious the game was never meant to be the successor to the Pit. Kind of like how the Pit was never meant to be the successor to what was the Sword of the Stars series, now that I think about it. While the Pit of Doom may become its own entity worthy by its own merits, there is always the original that you can call home. One where you're more likely to die come the next family get-together. For the 99.9% of people around the world who don't know what this metric means, this rating does not reflect the game's merits like IGN and GameSpot reviews. What this rating does provide, however, is a way to express the game's state of completion at the time of the review, as well as its development throughout early access. To determine this rating, my process is to break down a game's promised features and value proposition, content, the quality of the experience, gameplay, audio, or visuals, from what would be acceptable for a finished state, as well as stages of development like alpha or beta, quality. The performance and technical issues, optimization, and the overall production schedule, communication, and time spent in development, all with respect to the dev's team size, productivity. These values should be treated as qualitative rather than quantitative measurements, but the metric does give a numerical score to reflect how far a game is towards its completion. Now, to see this metric in action, here is a list of all the qualitative values including these categories. These statements on their own are what the simple rating reflects, but it's the bits and pieces throughout that help further define what each metric means for the complex rating. Afterwards, I will then provide a brief synopsis of each category with any details or relevant facts that help substantiate my decisions. You shouldn't treat my evaluation as gospel, but more like one series of experimental data to better formulate a conclusion, which I would encourage others to use this method or a similar system to evaluate early access products. If you want to know more about why the system is a necessary evil for early access products, as well as for their own benefit, you can read more about why I made this system with an article linked down below. As for now, let's move on with the analysis. As far as delivering what Kerberos Productions promised, a cooperative first-person take on the original Pit, the devs have already delivered on that goal. In addition, the crafting system has most of the recipes that I can recall from the original game. It's more difficult to compare how much is available if you don't separate the items from all the expansions. There still is the omission of the final floor, biomods, and other former features listed on the features list, but nothing that you would expect to be canned in the future, with the exception of the safe room. The only concern I have with the roadmap is that it doesn't state what content may be included from the Osmium edition. As a result, my decision is to give this section a lower rating than it probably deserves. In this category, Kerberos nailed not only its presentation, but specifically its sound design. which this latter category shouldn't be surprising since they have reused their sound assets. Not to imply that they were lacking to begin with. There is far more care and attention to detail put into the recreation of every model, and the added sense of scale is appreciated. Also, the interactable animations, which you can turn off just like in Far Cry 5, are another little touch that goes a long way. The only blunders that can take you out of the experience include procedural glitches with the exits, such as a hole in the ceiling sending you down to the next floor, as well as when the AI goes brain dead or they get stuck on the walls. As one more gameplay related problem, grenades need to be better designated on the UI because you cannot tell one type from another, which is only a problem in this game because you cannot pause the game in the middle of combat. Finally, despite the art style being more washed out compared to the colorful 2D sprites, the charm is still there to match the dark comedy of the original. Now, I alluded to this section way back at the start, and there are a couple of things to say. First, the default settings are helpful enough for most users who may struggle with the shadows and the heavy fog effects. If you are still suffering from performance issues, then you can also apply some general Unreal Engine 4 tweaks, such as resolution scaling, currently not configurable within the in-game options menu. You can visit the forum link down below for more details. The real issue is how much the game will overheat most hardware if you don't tweak these settings, which can turn some people away, but that seems to be a common Unreal Engine 4 problem. Finally, as I was unable to test the multiplayer servers, I cannot say anything about its netcode or any possible issues. Similar to nailing its presentation, Kerberos has also been transparent and responsive towards player feedback as well as providing multiple updates each month. From its early access release on October 26, 2018, Kerberos has released 2 major content patches, one for the crafting system, available since November, and the multiplayer mode since March of 2019. Throughout these months, minor improvements and quality of life fixes have been made, which this last one was posted May 1, 2019. All of this information leads me to trust that Pit Infinity will be released within the Q2 and Q4 timeframe of this year, which the devs have stated upfront the full release date and the state of its features are based on the level of support throughout its early access. With all this information out of the way, thank you for watching, and if you have any constructive criticism, questions, or suggestions on how to improve my early access rating system, please comment down below. May you enjoy the rest of your day, whether in or out of the pit.